Okay, so today we're going to be talking about books written about other books. Today I want to share with you my favourite works of literary criticism. Personally for me, a good book of literary criticism is one that really makes me inspired to read the books that are being talked about. It's not one that takes a kind of sneering or looking down sort of view of the work at hand. It's one where you can really tell that the writer of the work is inspired by fiction, they love it, and they're just kind of geeking out about it almost. A lot of literary criticism can just be quite dry and theory-laden, and while that's definitely needed for academics to work on, it's not so much interesting for someone who just loves to read books. So I wanted to share with you something that in general is a bit more accessible. Some of the books are a bit more theory-based, but most of them are accessible and engaging texts. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a little request. So I'm going to be doing a Q&A video very soon. I've already got some questions, but I would like a few more before I do the video. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me about books, about life, about anything, then feel free to just pop them in the chat and I will be answering them very soon. So the first book that I wanted to pick is actually a book that I haven't finished reading yet, but it's one that I am really enjoying and slowly sinking my teeth into, and I know it's going to be one that I will return to time and time again, and that is Harold Bloom's Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. In this very large book, Bloom takes us through every single Shakespeare play. Every play gets its own little essay, and some of them, like Hamlet, get a bit of a longer essay, but Bloom takes his time with each play to describe the play, to explain why he thinks it's significant or interesting, or in some cases, less significant and less interesting. Now this is a great companion text if you're doing what I'm doing at the minute, which is slowly working my way through every Shakespeare play. So every 2 weeks I pick one play and I watch it rather than reading it, and after I've watched the play I then read Bloom's essay and reflect on his words. And it's a really great way to engage with these plays. What I like about this way of watching the plays is that it's almost like you're going to the theatre with a friend, you watch the play and then you listen to them talk about it afterwards. And sometimes you agree with what they have to say, sometimes you don't. I think Bloom has some very interesting interpretations as well. One of his interpretations that I do have some sympathies with is his interpretation of The Taming of the Shrew, where he argues that Katerina's speech about being submissive to your husband at the end is more ironic and more deceptive than it seems on the surface. One thing that I disagree with though is Bloom's assessment of the Henry VI plays, which he considers to be inferior plays. And to some extent I do agree with him because he points out that there are lots of long rants in these plays that go on for a little bit too long, but I was blown away by the Henry VI plays. At least the adaptations that I saw, I thought they were fantastic. It's almost like Game of Thrones, all this political intrigue, lots of blood, lots of all this stuff going on. So I really enjoyed them, and I disagree a bit with Bloom there. Now I have read other works of Bloom. I read his book on the Western Canon, and while I did enjoy that book, I felt like he wrote in a slightly less accessible style there, whereas with this book he does write in a very engaging way. And that's what I want from a literary critic, because I'm not reading this as an academic and I'm not recommending it as an academic. I'm recommending it as a book that might help you appreciate these works. And that's what I think Bloom does really well. He writes in a conversational style, he does say interesting things, sometimes he talks about adaptations that he has seen of the plays, and he gives his interpretation of what kind of actor or actress you would need to pull off a particular character. So I think it's really interesting to get that kind of perspective. He's not just talking about dry theory, he's talking about the text, he's talking about different productions and everything else. So if you want to get into the Shakespeare canon and you want a little bit of a roadmap, a little bit of a guide, I would definitely recommend picking up this book by Bloom. And also I would give a special mention to his book on the Western Canon because it is also a very good book. Next up we have two books by probably my favourite literary critic and Harold Bloom's student incidentally, and that is Camille Paglia. And the first book of hers that I wanted to talk about is Break, Blow, Burn, which is a book of poetry criticism. For the longest time I never really got poetry at all. I just have memories of school and it being really difficult stuff and just not really understanding what was going on. And then I started to read narrative poems, which I found an easier way in because they're telling a story that's more tangible, so you can follow what's going on. And slowly I've been building myself up to reading more and more abstract poems, and this book really helped me get into that. Paglia takes us through 42 of the world's greatest poems. She does focus a lot on America, which some negative reviewers, point out and say, well, why are you focusing so much on one place? But I think that really with this book, what Paglia is doing is she's picking 42 poems that she personally relates to, as much as she also thinks that they're great poems, and that really shines through in the way that she talks about these poems. And to me, it doesn't really matter whether critics think that these are the poems that they would put in their best of lists. Some of them definitely are, but not all of them perhaps. But that really doesn't matter because Parlia just writes in a way that makes every single poem so interesting, and she makes you want to read them. She obviously also reprints the poems as well so that you can appreciate the poem, think about it yourself, then you read her essay on it, and then you can go back and sort of compare and maybe read her essay again. All the essays again are really short, so again it's something that you can just do in an afternoon. You could go through it in one big chunk, or you could do it slowly, poem by poem. Like Bloom, Parlia really wants to engage with ordinary readers, and I think she does this a bit better than Bloom as well. Bloom can't really get out of that academic stuffiness. Sometimes he does it reasonably well, but he's always got that kind of fuddy-duddy thing going on, whereas Parlia writes in a very snappy, engaging style all the time, and so she's a lot more accessible than Bloom is. I especially liked her reading of Shelley's Ozymandias, which is a great poem where you have Ozymandias, this king, and the poem kind of ruminates on these ruins of his great kingdom, and all that's left is this statue of him, and all of his great works and him as a person are gone, and all that's left is this object, this artist's object. And Parlia kind of suggests that this poem is about the kind of endurance of art over politics, over morality, and over leaders who think that they're so great and powerful. It's a great poem. She writes a fantastic essay on it, and it made that one of my favourite poems. And the most important thing about this book is, again, its inspiration. Parlia made me inspired to read every single poem that she talks about. She never talks down about the poets, even if she has some critical things to say. She clearly thinks that every single one of these poems is great, worth studying, worth appreciating, and she thinks you can learn something from them as well. Next we have another book by Parlia. This one is her more famous book, which is Sexual Personae. This is a huge epic book of criticism, and it's not just focusing on literature and poetry, it's also focusing on the physical arts as well. There's stuff about painting in here, there's stuff about sculpture, there's stuff going all the way from ancient Egypt and the Egyptians and the bust of Nefertiti, stuff from the agrarian period before that, the Greeks, Greek art, all the way to Emily Dickinson. Now this book is a bit more theory-based. Parlia does have a theory about art which is part Nietzschean, part Freudian, part her own style, and it's quite idiosyncratic as well, which makes it interesting. Roughly, she thinks that there are two opposing forces in art, like Nietzsche. There's the Apollonian, which is rationalist, it's about mind, it's about head, it's about logic, and there's the Dionysian, which is about the body, it's about revels and excitement and chaos. And she kind of sees these two opposing forces in art, but she doesn't just see them in this way. She also sees them in Judeo-Christianity and paganism and the opposition between those two things. And this is what she does. She kind of has all these different dualities and then sees how they appear and recur in art over time. Now what I like though about this book is, although that theory is there and it is in the background of most of what Parlia is doing, it doesn't intrude too much into her interpretations, and she's able, because of the flexibility of her theory, to sort of move around and explore different kinds of dualities here. So she's not as limited as other theorists that I'm going to talk about later seem to be. Another thing that I really like about this book is just how encyclopedic it is. Parlia knows so much about the stuff that the books that she's talking about. She's referencing all kinds of things all the time. Even the artists who she doesn't devote chapters to, their novels can come up and she can make comparisons. And oftentimes she'll even make comparisons with modern day art, pop culture, which a lot of critics will shy away from because of that kind of snobbishness. But I really like that Parlia does that. She just seems to have this eye for art in any form, and she doesn't really see these hierarchies that some people might see. She sees it on this kind of continuum of different styles of art, and she sees all these personas appearing throughout time. So that's really interesting, and it just makes you want to read everything that she's talking about. And in fact, I am slowly working my way through the books that she mainly focuses on in this text, just so it can come to life even more for me. That's going to be a big project though. I mean, I'm still in ancient Egypt reading a big book on ancient Egyptian mythology, so I think it's going to be a long time before I get all the way to Emily Dickinson, but I am going to enjoy the ride. And in any case, what comes through this book, again with Parlia, is her enthusiasm for everything that she writes about. And that's what I want, because when I'm reading these books about these great works, I want to finish those chapters and those books and think, wow, this actually is worth my time. I'm going to go and read that now and see if I share their views. Whereas, if you get a very cynical text that's just about condemning the work, then you don't really feel like reading it afterwards. It's like, well, what's the point if it's just, a terrible thing? So that's what I like. I like an enthusiastic writer who is passionate about what they're doing, who writes in an engaging way, and Parlia does that in spades. Okay, for the next choice we're moving into something a little bit more abstract and theoretical, but no less interesting because of that, and it is one of the first literary texts, or texts of literary criticism, that at least we have on record, and that is Aristotle's The Poetics. I came across this because I slowly want to try and get into aesthetics as part of my research that I do, and so I have this book on aesthetics that has texts, mainly extracts of texts going all the way from ancient Greece all the way up to modern philosophy, and Plato is in there, but I don't really like Plato's literary theory. He's quite condemning. He thinks that the artists should be excluded from his idealistic city because they're deceitful imitators. Don't agree with that. Whereas Aristotle is a bit more lenient, he's a bit more charitable to the value of art. And in the Poetics, he basically gives a theory of, well, a lot of things, but the thing that I want to focus on is his theory of drama, of tragedy in particular. It's a great introduction, especially if you're the sort of person like me where you feel like literature in any of its guises is a kind of craft. Yes, there is certainly a thing called taste, and yes, there are no real hard and fast rules in art because, part of the beauty of art is you can break the rules. Nevertheless, I do believe there are important structural components to most interesting or compelling stories, and when you break those rules, you want to do it for a reason rather than because you just don't understand what those rules of construction are. Aristotle breaks down tragedy into 6 key components, the most important ones being character, plot and thought, and the less important ones being spectacle, melody and diction. Spectacle is interesting because he sees it as the lowest in terms of importance. Spectacle refers to the costuming, the way things look or appear on the stage. I think a part of the reason maybe why Aristotle thought this is because ultimately the spectacle of a play is probably the most flimsy aspect of the play. It's not something that can really be preserved. Obviously things may have changed now because we have films, and so you can preserve the spectacle of a film. And so it's interesting how spectacle seems more important to us now, especially in film, where presentation actually becomes one of the key parts of the medium. Nevertheless, I do think there is something true to this idea that things like plot and character are the most important driving aspects of maybe any narrative really, and something like spectacle is more of a surface level thing. I also found it interesting because I've been kind of annoyed by a lot of adaptations recently of works of literature that I really enjoy, and a lot of my criticism of those things is that they do seem to really focus on spectacle, and they don't really care about the depth of the characters in the books that they're adapting, or the thoughts, the ideas that are trying to be represented by these works. So it kind of amused me that Aristotle kind of puts spectacle down here, and yet it seems like with modern adaptations, the thing that they do that's always the most original and changing thing is, oh, we'll just have, we'll give it a trendy spectacle, but not really add anything in terms of thought or character or plot that's interesting. But that's just me being a bit bitter maybe about some adaptations that I don't like. But let me know it down in the comments. What do you think of that idea? Do you think that plot and character are the most important parts of a work, or something like spectacle is less important? And finally, we have a book that I do find to be interesting and inspiring and worth reading, even if I disagree with quite a lot of it, at least when it comes to the portions of the book that deal with literature, and that is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. I read this, I think it must have been 2 years ago now, and I really enjoyed the reading experience. I think de Beauvoir writes in a very engaging way, and when she talks about literature, even though she is more critical than the other critics that I've talked about on this list, she does still manage to engage, and she refers a lot to French writers that I would never have heard of if I hadn't read her work, so I appreciate that as well. She has kind of 2 sections that are interesting for literary theory. There is a section where she talks directly about texts, and these include some French texts, but they also include critiques of Wuthering Heights, which we'll get to, and D.H. Lawrence. And they are two of my favourite writers, are Emily Bronte and D.H. Lawrence, and I really disagree with her critiques of them. But she also has another section of the book that deals with mythology, and in particular female mythology and different archetypes of womanhood and how they've been represented in literature over time. And these things are really interesting, regardless of what I happen to think about them, so it's worth reading the book. But one thing that I found is, once I finished reading The Second Sex, and then I went to read the text that she criticises, and the writers that she criticises, I found that actually I don't really agree with much of what she says, and I think she's quite selective in her readings, especially of her reading of Wuthering Heights. She has a very binary notion of gender in Wuthering Heights, where she sees Heathcliff as being incredibly, hypermasculine, and Catherine as being this sort of hysterical woman, and the fact that she dies halfway through the book is symbolic of the idea that a woman, if she's strong and assertive and powerful, will always die and be subsumed under the personality of the male. And she uses the famous "I am Heathcliff" quote to suggest that Catherine sees her identity as being subsumed under Heathcliff's. And she tries to insinuate that Emily Bronte is basically just a man in disguise, gender man in disguise, writing this book. And she writes in a masculine style and favours that sex. And I just found this to be a completely wrong interpretation. First of all, I think there's actually a lot of androgyny in both Catherine and in Heathcliff. Because while yes, Heathcliff is masculine in the sense of being strong and violent, he's also quite feminine in some of the ways that his emotions manifest. A hypermasculine man generally is in control of his emotions. He's cold and calculating, whereas Heathcliff is prone to breaking out into hysterical sobs. And Catherine, while yes, she can be incredibly wild and ferocious, she can also be sometimes cold and calculating. So I think both characters actually have a lot of androgyny going on that de Beauvoir can't get past because she's focusing on this sort of gender binary thing, which, to be fair, a lot of critics of Wuthering Heights seem to do. Another thing that irritates me is that, fair enough, Catherine does say, "I am Heathcliff," and she does die halfway through the story. That's true. However, Heathcliff also says several times about Catherine that she is his soul, and she is a part of him just as much as she feels like he is a part of her. So there's an equality going on here. Both of them have a mixed identity. Both of them feel like they're a part of each other. So it's not really correct just to say that, Catherine's identity is subsumed within Heathcliff's. I mean, it is, but it also goes the other way. Also, the criticism seems to ignore the second half of the book. Yes, Catherine does die halfway through, but then we have the younger Catherine, who in many senses is a kind of, spiritual sister to the original Catherine, and she does break free from the cycles, and she does break free in a way that her mother didn't. Ultimately it is her that resolves the tragedy of the story, because she doesn't let history and the appearance of Hareton, who comes across as quite violent and rough, eventually she makes friends with him, she teaches him to read, and they have a happy ever after together as equals. And so I just really don't agree with her interpretation there. I also found her interpretation of Lawrence to be quite off. Now, I'm less sure of this because I think she focuses a lot more on The Rainbow and Women in Love, which are books that I haven't read. But what I do find about Lawrence is that, at least with something like Sons and Lovers, it seems like an important aspect of his work in that book. The way that men perceive women is oftentimes quite uncharitable. So we have the character Paul Morell, and he has these relationships with two women, and in particular one of them, Miriam. He has a certain view of her that is quite negative, and at one point his other lover tells him this. She's like, you've completely got this woman wrong, how foolish are you? And so Lawrence does seem to have an awareness of the limitations that he, as a man, has on interpreting women and femininity. So to kind of imply that he doesn't, in the way that I think de Beauvoir does, is kind of unfair, but I will leave that one until I've read Women in Love, just so I can be 100% sure that my criticism goes ahead. Overall, I think de Beauvoir goes wrong in a way that someone like Parlier I don't think does. Both books have these big theories, and they use these big theories to analyse their works. But Parlier manages to augment the works that she's talking about, and she also is willing to bend her theories a bit. She lets the text sort of speak to her, and then she uses the theory in some kind of negotiation. Whereas what de Beauvoir does is she has her theory of gender, and she imposes this on the text. And it's ironic because at the beginning of The Second Sex, she complains about Freudians and Marxists, and she says that these two schools of thought, when it comes to analysing the concept of woman, do this kind of reductive thing, and it's a problem. But it seems like she does the same thing herself. And so while I don't fully agree with her theory or the ways that she analyses these texts, I do think that she still has some very interesting things to say. And I think the thing that I really do resonate with is this idea that people sometimes find it hard to represent woman in fiction. But I also think that applies the other way around as well. While yes, Lawrence might have difficulties representing women in a way that de Beauvoir thinks is true, I think that a lot of female writers do the same thing with representing men as well. In fact, one of my favourite writers, Angela Carter, I think she's a great writer. I think she's a bit off when it comes to her male characters. But that's just one of the difficulties. If you're a certain gender or you come from a certain perspective, it's always going to be a bit more difficult to understand and represent clearly and well someone with an opposing or different identity to you. Nevertheless, it's an interesting book of literary criticism, and that's why it's on this list. And it is also a good work of philosophy that touches on way more than just literature as well. Alright, that is it for everything on this list. Let me know down in the comments whether you ever read books of literary criticism, whether you've read any of the writers that I've talked about today and what you think of them, and let me know if there are any books of literary criticism that you've read that you think they really inspire you, because I'm always looking for books like this to read. I don't read them often, but when I do, I'm always way more inspired to read afterwards, at least if I pick the right critics. Don't forget to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and let me know down in the comments if you have any questions for that Q&A video. Until next time, take care everyone, ta-ra!